Welcome to this week's edition of Ask an MS Expert. I'm Jon Strum, and I'm the host of the Real Talk MS podcast. Each week, Real Talk MS reaches thousands of people in more than 90 countries around the world with the news that people affected by MS need to know. I'm also a member of the International Progressive MS Alliance Scientific Steering Committee. I'm a district activist leader and trustee for the National MS Society, and I chair the Society's California Government Relations Advisory Committee. My wife, Jean, lived with progressive MS for 23 years, so I've had a front row seat experiencing all the ways that MS can impact a family. I'm thrilled to be with you today. I see that people are continuing to join our webcast, so let's give them just another few seconds and then we'll get started. I'd like to acknowledge and thank today's national sponsors, Biogen and Bristol-Myers Squibb, for their support. Support from the MS community partners, it helps the National MS Society reach our goal of providing up-to-date information and support through programs like Ask an MS Expert. And thanks to all of you who are joining us on GoToWebinar, Facebook Live, and YouTube Live. The MS Society's Ask an MS Expert webcast is designed to connect you with MS experts who are ready to answer your questions on the topics that impact people affected by MS every day. So as I chat with our expert today, please feel free to post your questions on Facebook and YouTube, or type them into the question box if you're joining us on GoToWebinar. We'll try to answer as many of your questions as we can during the Q&A portion of today's program. Before we dive into today's program, I'd like to acknowledge that these are new and rapidly evolving times, so we do have a disclaimer to review. COVID-19 is a new coronavirus, and the published data available about this virus and MS are limited. The information and recommendations presented on this program are based upon individual professional opinion of MS experts and the evidence currently available about MS, COVID-19 vaccines, and disease-modifying therapies. This is a rapidly evolving situation, and we will update information as it becomes available. The information that is shared does not substitute for your healthcare provider recommendations. Please check with your healthcare provider before making any changes to your treatment plan. And be sure to check the MS Society's website for updated information at nationalmssociety.org/COVID-19. After a very challenging 2020, the availability of COVID-19 vaccines represents real hope. But the pandemic won't end because of the vaccines. The pandemic ends when we get vaccinated. And many of you have been wondering whether people with MS can safely take the COVID-19 vaccines. The National MS Society convened a group of experts to provide guidance for people living with MS based on data from the general population and the vaccine clinical trials and data from studies of other vaccines in MS. This team of experts is being led by the chair of the Society's National Medical Advisory Committee, Dr. Nancy Sicotte. Dr. Sicotte is a professor and vice chair of education in the Department of Neurology at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles, California, where she's also the director of the Multiple Sclerosis Program and founding director of the Neurology Residency Training Program. Now, when Dr. Sicotte joined us last month for our final Ask an MS Expert webcast of 2020, we discussed the work that this task force was doing. And as she promised us, Dr. Sicotte is back today to talk about the vaccine guidance that the Society has just released. Welcome back, Dr. Sicotte, and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, John. It's a pleasure to be here.
You know, there are many vaccines being studied for COVID-19, and other vaccines have been approved in other countries. So, Dr. Sicotte, before we dive into the guidance from the Society, can you remind us about which vaccines this guidance applies to?
Thank you, John. And I just want to emphasize this is a rapidly evolving situation, and there are lots of pieces of information out there. And now with our internet, you can get access to information that applies not to your specific situation here in the United States, potentially, but in other countries where things are different. So here in the US, there are 2 vaccines that the FDA has approved via the emergency use authorization. And those are both what we call mRNA vaccines, and that includes the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine. So for our guidance that we've put together with the task force, we've focused on these 2 vaccines, which are the ones that are available here in the United States.
And how do mRNA vaccines work?
So mRNA vaccines, these 2 put together 2 pieces of interesting technology. So the first is the delivery system, which are these nanoparticles that have been developed, where they are in, when you have the vaccine, they allow the mRNA, which is the sort of the business end of the vaccine, to be delivered into a cell very efficiently. So these nanoparticles are one part of the new technology. mRNA is the instructions that are developed from your DNA that allows a protein to be made. And so these instructions that have been packaged into these little nanoparticles are only for one piece of the COVID-19, it's the SARS-CoV virus, and that's the spike protein. So these mRNA vaccines are delivering a very key component of the virus, but not the virus itself. And it delivers this into the cell, and then the cell's own machine will make copies of this spike protein and then display it on the surface of the cell and distribute it into the circulation so that the immune system gets to see this very important piece that would be seen if you had a real SARS-CoV infection, a COVID-19 infection. And so your immune system gets primed and educated to respond to the spike protein. And we think this spike protein is the key entry point for the virus into the body. So the way these vaccines are working rather is very clever in that it is really promoting an immune response to the most critical piece of the virus. So it's very effective and efficient.
So here in the US, we have 2 approved vaccines. Is there a preferred vaccine for someone who has MS?
So in terms of the 2 that we have available to us, they are very similar and we don't have a preference per se. I think an overarching theme that we'll be talking about today is if you have an opportunity to get a vaccine, get it. And don't be too picky about which one, because truthfully, they're very, very similar. The Pfizer vaccine requires a colder storage, and so it may have more limited availability. So a lot of the medical centers, for example, here at Cedars, we have the Pfizer vaccine available to us because we have a lot of freezers that we can store it. The Pfizer vaccine is given in 2 doses, as both of them are, and the Pfizer one is at a 21-day interval. The Moderna can be stored at slightly cooler temperature, or warmer temperatures, I should say, easier to store. And that one is given at an interval of 28 days. But in terms of how they work and their composition, they're very, very similar.
We know that many people have concerns about how quickly these clinical trials were completed. Do you feel that these trials were rushed?
So I think this has been a concern of everyone seeing how rapidly these vaccines have come to the market. But I want to assure people, and this is in particular for any of the vaccines that are approved in the United States, that they have gone through the usual processes. What's really interesting is the way there was an anticipation that these vaccines were going to be in great demand. And so the production of them went into effect right at the beginning, even before the clinical trials were done. But the clinical trials follow the usual and customary process with a phase 1, 2, and 3. And the phase 3 is the final one, which involves large numbers of individuals being treated with the vaccine in a double-blind fashion. So we have a placebo group to compare. And this is the gold standard of evidence-based medicine. And those trials were completed and included an observation period after the vaccinations were completed to collect all of the safety data just as we would in any typical vaccination trial. I think what is so amazing about the vaccines is how quickly they've become available to us, but that's because this was some good timing, serendipity. These interesting technologies were being developed, and so they were repurposed very quickly to tackle the COVID-19 crisis.
You know, while we know that both vaccines require 2 doses, we're hearing proposals suggesting that the plan should be getting just 1 dose of the vaccine now to more people so that more people get some protection. What's the current CDC recommendation in terms of how many doses of the vaccine someone needs for it to be considered fully effective?
So I think this is a difficult question and a difficult calculus to make, and maybe for people to understand why we wouldn't just give everyone 1 dose once it's available. The issue again goes back to the clinical trials and to what we think of in terms of our science and our scientific method. We have data that is related to the 2 doses. And so when we say that the vaccine is 95% effective, that is in the setting of having those 2 doses. So the CDC currently is still recommending that individuals have both doses the way that the vaccines were tested and approved for emergency use. So I do a little bit if people have 1 vaccination and then they're lost to follow up, or they don't have access to have the second vaccination. So I think to the best of our ability, all of these vaccination procedures here in the United States that they're being stood up are with this idea that you'll come back and have your second vaccination to get the maximum protection. Because it really is an amazing response that people will have, a 95% protection, but that's only if you have both doses.
So if someone gets the first dose of a specific vaccine, do they need to get that same vaccine for their second dose, or can they mix and match, or doesn't it matter?
That is a very fascinating question for which I don't have any data. And I would say, all things being equal, you should get the same vaccine for both doses. There are differences between them that are subtle, and there could be differences between the response. It has not been studied. So my advice would be to certainly aim to get the second dose from the same manufacturer, the same vaccine.
Do we know how long the protection from the vaccine is going to last once you've had that second dose?
So that is a great question. It is a somewhat unanswered question based on the fact that these vaccines have been only developed in the last year. We don't have years and years of data to look at. Certainly, the drug companies, the pharmaceutical companies will be gathering this data, and public health institutions will be gathering this data, because this is really a key question. Is it something that we'll need to get a booster every year the way we do for the flu, or will this be 2 shots and done? My hope is it will be the latter, and I think there's some reasons to think that that will be the case because of the strength of the response, the immune response that has been shown with the currently developed vaccines. But the truth is, we just won't know until we have more information. I think there's a lot of indication that these vaccines will give us protection for several months to a year at a minimum. So we do have time to gather that data and to be sure.
We've received some questions regarding the new strain of COVID-19 that's cropping up around the world, including here in the United States. Is this new strain any worse for people living with MS?
So as far as we know, the new strain, the main difference is that it's easier to transmit. And so that may be underlying some of the, just dramatic increases in cases that we're seeing, in particular in the UK. There's no indication that the virus itself is more lethal, either to regular folk or to people who have MS. But you can see the impact on the healthcare system. When you have more people infected, there's a certain percentage that will become seriously ill, who will then need to go to the hospital. And so in that setting, we have limited hospital resources, and you get into this negative cycle of of a crisis management of this health situation. But in terms of the lethality of the new variant, there doesn't seem to be any differences that we've seen so far.
And do we know whether the approved vaccines will work on this new strain?
So there's limited data, but there has been some information provided by Pfizer indicating that their vaccine does seem to be effective against this variant that has emerged. And it's not surprising because the spike protein is that the vaccines were built to create an immune response to is a very potent trigger for the immune response, and these changes in the variant are just small changes within the spike protein. Doesn't change the whole distribution or the whole shape of the spike protein. So I think we can feel pretty confident that the vaccines that have been developed to date will be effective against this variant. And the Pfizer data suggests that, and I'm sure we'll see more data going forward.
Well, thank you, Dr. Sicotte. Before we continue our discussion, I want to welcome those of you who have continued to join us on GoToWebinar, Facebook Live, and YouTube Live. Please let us know what's on your mind. Post your comments and questions on Facebook and YouTube, and type them into the question box if you're joining us on GoToWebinar. Our Ask an MS Expert live event takes place at this same time every Friday. So please help us make sure that everyone knows about it by sharing news about the webcast with your family and friends and on all your social media platforms. Dr. Sicotte, let's talk about the new guidance on the safety and efficacy of COVID-19 for vaccines for people living with MS. First, who was involved in developing this guidance?
So this was a group that was convened by the National MS Society to include MS specialists, clinicians, as well as experts on vaccines and virologists. And it's a very dedicated and bright group of individuals. We all got together and we've been working very hard to put out this advice because we know that there is a lot of concern in the MS community and a real hunger for some information.
Will the guidance be updated as new vaccines become available?
Yeah, I really want to emphasize this, that we've created this guidance as what we would call a living document. So this is a very fast-moving field. As I said to you, we've just been hearing that the new variant does seem to be covered by the Pfizer vaccine. This is information just in the last couple of days. We know that there are other vaccines in the pipeline, and which will certainly be coming up to the FDA and may be approved for use in the United States. So we will continue to update this guidance to reflect the changes, new information that we develop and that is made available to us, as well as experiences of patient populations as more and more people become vaccinated.
So the guidance says that the vaccine is safe for people with MS. What science did the group of experts use to arrive at their conclusion?
So we want to preface this by saying that these vaccines were not tested specifically in people who have MS. And in fact, people who have MS were excluded from the clinical trials. What we based our information on is knowledge about vaccines in general in their relationship to MS, and then knowledge about the safety profiles of these specific vaccines. And based on that information, we feel very confident that these vaccines will be safe for people who have multiple sclerosis as well as other immune conditions.
Will people with MS experience the same side effects to the vaccine as the general population might?
So this is a great question, and I think an important question for our patient population. So there are some side effects associated with the vaccine. I will tell you, I've had dose number 1, and I'm getting dose number 2 tomorrow. And I experienced some symptoms with the first dose, which is fairly typical. They were mild myalgias, and then I had a headache for a few days. I tend to get headaches because I'm a neurologist, and about 60% of us have migraines. So my migraines got kicked off a little bit after the first dose. I've heard from my colleagues who have had the second dose that one is associated with a little bit increased risk of things like a low-grade fever and some malaise, which means feeling kind of crappy, and some muscle aches. So for folks who have MS, I think we all know once if they've got some kind of viral infection or bacterial infection, that tends to kick off symptoms. So what we are expecting that we may see from our patients and what they may want to keep track of is what sort of a worsening of their underlying symptoms that could occur if they have a low-grade fever, for example. We call this in the MS world a pseudo-relapse. It is not a relapse. It's not a new inflammatory attack, but it's a worsening of underlying symptoms. So we're going to be keeping a close eye on that, but I do want to put that out there for our community to be aware of the fact that that might be something that's a little bit unique to our MS population that the general population wouldn't necessarily experience.
And just to clarify that even further, pseudo-relapse is not a relapse. It's not an MS relapse.
That is not a relapse. That is just a worsening of underlying symptoms, and we expect these to resolve very quickly if they happen at all. Some people will not have any kinds of symptoms at all, but if they were to happen, this would be something that would resolve within a day or two after the vaccination. Not a relapse.
The guidance is very direct. People with MS should get the COVID-19 vaccine. So does this really mean everyone? Does it apply to both relapsing and progressive forms of MS?
Yes, everyone should get the vaccine. And in particular, we know that people who have more disabling forms of MS are at a higher risk for more severe COVID infections. But the truth is, John, in order for us to get past this pandemic, we need as many people as possible to get vaccinated. That is the road to get us out of this pandemic that we've been in now for almost a year.
What about the people who have already had COVID-19? Should they get the vaccine?
So the CDC recommends that people who have had an infection also get vaccinated, and this is a sort of like a booster effect. And also because we don't know for sure if an infection will give you long-lasting immunity, and also the immune responses to natural infections are variable. So the recommendation currently is if you've had a COVID-19 infection, that you wait at least 90 days to have the vaccination. The feeling is you will be protected during that 90-day period, but then you should seek vaccination after that. That's a recommendation. It's not a hard and fast rule. You certainly wouldn't want to be vaccinated if you're still infected with COVID-19 or still having symptoms. So you should certainly be recovered from the infection before you get your vaccine.
And what about people who are on a disease-modifying therapy? Are the approved vaccines safe to use with MS medications?
The answer to that question, John, is yes. The vaccine is safe regardless of the disease-modifying therapies that you are on. This is not a live vaccine. There is no concern with using this vaccine in individuals who are immunosuppressed from their medications. We are currently working on another update of advice. This would be regarding these very specific questions around disease-modifying therapies for our patients, as well as for our practitioners who are treating individuals living with MS.
Do we know whether the vaccine will impact how well someone's disease-modifying therapy works for them? Could they possibly make a DMT less effective?
No, there is no evidence that the vaccine has an interaction with the disease-modifying therapies that we use for people living with MS. The vaccine will not impact the effectiveness of your disease-modifying therapies.
And if I can turn that same question around, can someone's disease-modifying therapy make the vaccine any less effective?
So this is an issue, and this is a confusing issue. So I do want to just reiterate the fact that the vaccine itself does not make your disease-modifying therapies work less well. So, but the opposite is possibly true for a very small subset of the therapies that we use. And those are what we call the B-cell depleters, and that would be ocrelizumab, rituximab, ofatumumab are the medications that are on the market now for people living with MS. And the issue with that has to do with the way that medication works and evidence that we have from some other studies that have been done showing that flu vaccine and some other vaccines were less effective in individuals who had just received their treatment for with one of these medications. And that's because of the way those drugs work. They're actually impacting the immune response that is the same immune response that eventually leads to these antibodies, the immune protection that the vaccine provides. So I don't want to get too far in the weeds with that, because the truth is we do know that even if you're on one of those medications, your immune system will still respond to the vaccine. So if you are on one of those medications, you should still get vaccinated, and you should get vaccinated and know that you're going to have some response to the vaccine.
Are there any other special considerations that someone living with MS may need to make to determine when they should get their vaccine?
So because of this effect that I've just discussed regarding these certain class of DMTs, the B-cell depleters, there is an optimal time for getting the vaccine if you're on one of those medications. And this is advice that we will be providing in a published form, but in our initial discussions, there is evidence that waiting 3 months after your infusion as a guide. So if that's possible, to wait 3 months, if you're on these 6 monthly infusions, wait 3 months before you get vaccinated. That would be the preference. But I also want to say, if you are offered the vaccine, don't wait. Just take it, even if it's not within that if it's been less than 3 months, because we know that you will have a response to the vaccine regardless.
Now, the guidance encourages people at highest risk for severe COVID-19 to get the vaccine as soon as it's available to them. Who falls into that category?
So what we know from the data that's been collected across the world in regards to people living with MS and their risk of severe COVID, it does fall in line with the other risks that we've seen for those who don't have MS. And that includes having other underlying conditions such as hypertension, diabetes, lung disease, and other comorbidities that make you at risk for more severe COVID. In our MS population, what we have found is individuals who are more disabled seem to have a higher risk of developing severe COVID. Now, that's hard to disentangle from some of those other comorbidities because people tend to be a little bit older if they're disabled. So certainly anyone who is having difficulties with ambulation or requires a walker or a wheelchair, that would put them into that group that we would consider at a higher risk for developing more severe COVID symptoms.
Well, the people you just described in that category seem like the most vulnerable. So wouldn't they be more at risk for a bad reaction to the vaccine?
So there's been no evidence to suggest that. And in fact, as you see, the way the vaccine's been rolled out, it's been these very vulnerable people who have been first in line. So we look at the nursing homes and the other group homes where individuals who are living with significant disabilities have been vaccinated first. And we've seen no evidence that they are more or less likely to have difficulties tolerating the vaccine. So I don't think this will be a problem for our community either.
I've heard that after someone gets the vaccine, they should still follow the CDC recommendations for social distancing, washing their hands frequently, and wearing a mask. Why is that?
So this is a great question, and it may seem counterintuitive, but the truth is we don't know if you've been vaccinated, if you are also still capable, even though you wouldn't be sick, if you are capable of transmitting the virus to someone else. So we don't have that information, and that it's very important that we continue to practice all of those social distancing, mask wearing, and hand hygiene as we work through this process. I promise you eventually we'll be able to dispense with those, but we need to have more information about how a vaccinated person responds and whether or not the virus could be transmitted from someone, even though they themselves are not sick. And I think we have seen that there are a lot of individuals who are asymptomatic, but still able to spread the virus. So this is a concern that as individuals become vaccinated, that they don't just throw off their masks and throw caution to the wind until we know better, because it could be that you'll be fine, but you could put others at risk. And until we know that, this is the best way forward.
Well, we've covered a lot of really important information about why everyone living with MS should get the COVID-19 vaccine as soon as it's available to them. What are the top 3 takeaways that you'd like our audience to remember?
So first and foremost, vaccination is safe for those living with MS. So that includes this vaccine, but also the flu vaccine and almost every other vaccine that is out there. I think this is something that has permeated our community and is part of the vaccine reluctance that we see in some of our patients. So vaccinations are safe for people with MS, and this is with the exception of live vaccines in individuals who are very immunocompromised. But none of the vaccines that we've been talking about for COVID are live. So all the vaccines that we've been talking about are safe for individuals with MS. The second takeaway is, if you have an opportunity to get the vaccine, as soon as you have that opportunity, you should take it. This is the way out of the pandemic. This is how we can keep ourselves safe, our communities safe, our families safe, and our medical system available to us if we should need it for something not related to COVID. And number 3, I would say, is that even though you're on a disease-modifying therapy, you should have your vaccine. You should talk to your physician if there's an opportunity to optimize the timing, but don't get too down in the weeds and worried about that. Get your vaccination even though you're on these medications.
Well, thank you, Dr. Sicotte, for walking us through some important information that I think everyone's been waiting for. Now let's continue taking more of the questions that our audience has for you. James wants to know where he can get the vaccine. So how does someone find out where the vaccine is being administered in their area?
So this is a great question, James, and this is one of the things that I think is making everyone a little bit on edge, because it's a confusing situation currently. So right now, the vaccinations are being controlled on a state-by-state basis. So it's going to be different for every state, and probably where you live in particular in your city and so forth. So right now there is work being done to stand up mass vaccination locations, and the states are different in how far along they've come. I'm here in California. I can tell you that they are using Dodger Stadium is being stood up, Disneyland, and other medical centers are getting prepared to be able to vaccinate individuals on a mass scale. What I recommend is that you go to your local public health website, and I think we're going to be providing the CDC link to you, and then you would go to your local, to your statewide public health and look there for updated information. I know it is frustrating, it is confusing, and it is on a state-by-state basis right now. So we will just have to keep looking forward to getting more information as it becomes available.
Dennis says his neurologist does not recommend getting the COVID-19 vaccine at this time because there's not enough safety data for MS patients. Now, Dennis read the National MS Society's press release just the other day, January 11th, that recommends all MS patients receive that vaccine. Now Dennis is confused and he doesn't know what to do. Do you have any further insight for Dennis?
Yeah, so I think this goes back to the comment that I made in the beginning about ideas about vaccine safety for people who are living with MS. And that debate has been settled over and over again in terms of non-live vaccines being safe for those who are living with MS. I think what we need to do is put this in perspective. So when we're thinking about a vaccination, there's always a certain risk, however minuscule, for any kind of intervention. And that includes in any kind of medical treatment do. Even having your blood drawn, there's a risk that you could end up with a bruise. But what you have to put on the other side of that is, what is the benefit? And in this case, it's very clear for the vaccine. The risks are vanishingly small based on all the data that we have. The efficacy of the vaccine is very high, 95%, much higher than many of the other vaccines that we would recommend. And the risks of getting COVID-19, especially for our community, for those who are living with other comorbidities or disabilities, is extraordinarily high. So when you put all of those things together, unless this individual, I think his name was Dennis, unless he wants to have to stay in his home and not be out in the world for many more months to come, the calculus is quite clear that it is a safe and effective vaccine and that people should get it.
Well, Donna is wondering if you know of any MS patients that received the vaccine, and did they experience any side effects or MS relapses?
So that's a great question, and this is definitely information that we will be collecting as we go along. I know of at least a handful of my patients who also happen to be healthcare workers who had access to the vaccine and who have been vaccinated. And I'm happy to say that there have been no untoward effects and certainly no relapses that I have seen or heard about or been notified about. So we will be collecting this information, certainly, and we will be able to provide more reassurance as we go forward. As I said, there will be post-vaccination effects that many people may notice, which would include potentially a little bit of a fever that might bring out old symptoms temporarily. But this is not an MS relapse.
I think this is something you touched upon earlier, but Brittany is asking, so maybe we can circle back to it. She wants to know whether the COVID-19 vaccine prevents you from spreading the virus to other people.
So this is a key question. This is certainly the hope that once everyone is vaccinated, we won't be able to spread the virus to someone maybe who hasn't gotten the vaccine yet, but we just don't know that. That data is not currently available, and in the absence of that, the recommendations are very clear that we continue all the social distancing, masking, and hand hygiene that we've been doing up to this point.
Well, while you and I have been chatting, my partner, Julie Fiel, has been in the background fielding additional questions from some of our audience. Julie, you have some questions that you've caught late in the game?
I mean, just one or two questions have come in, and I can't even keep up, Dr. Sicotte. So I'm going to jump right in, and I'm trying to take questions that we're getting from multiple viewers and listeners and lump them together. So I have a question that Dave and Romy, I think I'm pronouncing it correctly. I have a question about the DMTs that you mentioned, some of them weakening the effect of the vaccine. And they're wanting to know if there's any way to know by how much does the vaccine get weakened. And I think what they're trying to say is it really worth getting then if it's not going to give them that same level of protection?
So that's a great question, and the truth is we don't know because we don't have that data. What we're doing is extrapolating from the data that we do have, which is from this other study that I quoted, the Veloci study, that looked at vaccination responses in individuals who had been treated with one of those drugs, ocrelizumab. But even in that situation, there was at least a 30% response in antibody titers, antibody levels in those individuals who had been treated with the ocrelizumab, the B-cell depleter. So again, as we're thinking about the effectiveness of these vaccines, these are 95% effective in ideal situations. We are very confident there will be some protection that would be given from having the vaccine. And the other point I would make, what we do know from the vaccine trials that have been done so far, there have been, as I said, it's 95% effective. So 5%, there have been some cases of people who got COVID even after they had been vaccinated, but none of those cases were severe COVID. So the other thing to recognize is, even though the vaccination may not be working at the perfect high level that you want, it will give you some level of protection that would allow you potentially to not have as severe a course of the disease. And I think that's absolutely worth it. If we could make sure that anytime people got infected with this virus, that it was just a minor, like a head cold, then we could get on with it. And so that, we think, is something that even in a suboptimal vaccination response, it would give you a higher likelihood of having milder disease.
Very important points to mention. Thank you for that. I'm hearing from a few people who have had allergic reactions to some of the disease-modifying therapies, and they have questions about whether that places them at increased risk for a bad reaction or an allergic reaction to the vaccine itself. So Kimberly says she has secondary progressive MS, but years ago she had a reaction to Tysabri, and she wants to know if she's still a candidate for the vaccine. I also heard from someone who was told that because she can't use Avonex or any of the other injectable medications for MS, that means she can't get vaccines. What can you tell us about that?
So what we know is that these immediate post-injection allergic reactions are extremely rare. So these are not common events, and when they have occurred, it has been most of the time in the cases of individuals who have these hypersensitivity reactions, such that they are carrying around EpiPens. So these are the people who, if they got a bee sting, or if they have some other kind of environmental trigger, that they need to use their epinephrine pen. For individuals that, for these kinds of responses that you're describing, that doesn't fit within that same category. There are lots of people who have had responses to injectable medications, or who develop a sensitivity to a drug like Tysabri, which is a monoclonal antibody, but that does not translate into having an allergic reaction to this vaccine. So that said, everyone who gets their vaccine will be monitored and will be getting their vaccine in a situation where there is availability of these rescue medications and so forth, should they have this response. But I just want to emphasize the fact this is exceedingly rare and only a handful of cases, given the tens of thousands and now millions of doses that have been given. So those conditions would not preclude those individuals from moving forward with their vaccine.
Great. I know you talked about this, but we had lots of questions, so I'm gonna let you reiterate it or maybe elaborate more, but lots of people, including Patricia, want to know how many people with MS were in the clinical trials for these particular vaccines. I think you mentioned that some trials and some had different exclusion criteria than others. We're hearing from some people who are telling us they did participate in the clinical trials. So what can you tell people who have MS, I should clarify, what can you tell us? What do we know in terms of, were people with MS included? Do we know how many? Will we know that information?
So my understanding is that the inclusion-exclusion criteria typically for these vaccination trials would exclude individuals who had known autoimmune diseases. That's pretty typical. Now, it's very possible that there are people who had MS were enrolled in the studies, but I think the important question to ask, there has not been a study that looked specifically at individuals who have MS in relation to other people who don't have MS in terms of safety, efficacy, side effects, and so forth. So whether you had a handful of people with MS that were enrolled in these trials, even if they all did great, which we assume they have, truthfully, if you're looking at evidence-based, that's not enough information to be able to say definitively that this was either bad or good for people with MS. You would really have to design a separate study, and I don't know that that will be done, to be honest. So what we're having to do is take the data that we have and extrapolate that to the population. And again, I just want to emphasize that what we're looking at is a risk and a benefit. And if the vaccine were only 30% effective, for example, it might be a different calculus for people, because there's a low risk that it's going to protect me, and there's this maybe small risk that I might have some side effect or I might feel bad after I get the vaccine. But what we know about these vaccines is they're 95% effective. So your benefit is enormous, and the risks, as we've seen and talked about, are very, very small. So we have to kind of put that into perspective, even though we don't have specific information that we would love to have about people living with MS, so that we could give statistics and we could tell you exactly what to expect. But based on everything we know, the risks are low, the benefit is high.
Very helpful. We've heard from a few people, Lisa and Pat in particular, who are asking about starting a new disease-modifying therapy. So it sounds like their provider has decided they need to switch therapy. They're not a new person with MS, but they're changing therapy, and they're asking if the timing of switching medications is important. And I don't know which medications, but I thought I could ask you to comment on that, and to maybe add to a little bit of detail. I'm getting a lot of questions about each of the DMTs, even from injectables like beta-seron. I heard from a nurse who says it's available to her, and she's trying to decide if she should time her injection of her beta-seron with the vaccine. So what can you tell us about, let's look at all of the DMTs if we have time, Jon, and what's important to know in terms of timing? Which drugs is it important to time, and which drugs does it not matter as much?
Okay, so that's a lot.
It is
so
a
I'll
lot.
do that in a sequential way. So the vast majority of disease-modifying therapies do not interact at all with the vaccine, the vaccine's effectiveness, or anything like that. So if you're on any of the injectables, and that would include all the interferon preparations and Copaxone, those don't have any relationship to the vaccine. So go ahead and continue to use your DMTs as you normally do, and get your vaccine, and don't worry about any of that. Oral therapies is in general the same in terms of the dimethyl fumarate preparations and Gilenya, the fingolimod, and all of that class of medications, and the other antimetabolites like Aubagio. None of that is going to be impacted by when you get your vaccine. So continue to take those as you normally do. The only other oral therapy that there could be a role for timing in is cladribine. And because that does deplete B cells like the other medications. So again, we would emphasize waiting 3 months after you had a cladribine dose. Induction would be the ideal, but if you have access to the vaccine, go ahead and get it. Now, when we go to the B cell depleters, where we're talking about the infusion medications, and that would be ocrelizumab and rituximab, and now ofatumumab, which is actually a subcutaneous drug. The recommendations of all of those medications, regardless of the COVID pandemic and so forth, is to get vaccinations prior to starting those medications when possible. And that is because of this recognition that vaccines may be impacted, the effectiveness of vaccines may be impacted by those medications. So if you are switching over to one of these so-called B cell depleters, that would be a time to think about getting your vaccine prior to starting those medications. So that would be an important timing question. But for these individuals that are perhaps switching from an injection to one of those other oral medications, not a problem. What we want to keep as a principle is we want to make sure that we're treating MS and that we're getting our DMTs, our proper treatment for minimizing disease activity and multiple sclerosis as a priority while we're fitting in the vaccination when it becomes available. So I don't know if I got that in all the specifics.
You did great. I know there's a point in our guidance that I think would be good to emphasize here. It was a point that you made that's included in our guidance. And it's that decisions should be made with healthcare providers. And relevant to the discussion around DMTs, the point is to not stop your DMT without talking with your healthcare professional and not trying to change the schedule or alter it, because some DMTs, it can be very dangerous for your MS if you stop them quickly.
Right. So I would also emphasize that you should not be modifying how you're taking your medications or changing them, certainly without doing this in concert with your physician. And if your physician is also confused, because this is a rapidly evolving new field, we will be providing expert advice or information as our next step for the task force, so that we can all share our best practices with each other.
So we had a question from Tony, and Tony is asking if someone is taking a DMT, and I think we could just say in general for anyone, whether they're on a DMT or not, after they get the vaccine, do they need to be extra cautious? I think the question is implying, am I going to be contagious? Did I get a piece of this virus through the vaccine? And do I need to be protecting others when I'm around them for a certain period of time?
So the answer to that is definitively no. You are not contagious because you do not have live virus as a result of having your vaccine. So you can't pass anything related to the vaccine onto other people. But again, just to reiterate, because there is a gap in our knowledge about whether you can transmit the virus even though you've been vaccinated, you should still continue to do the usual protections, but you wouldn't have to do additional protections because you had the vaccine. We're hopeful in the long term that we'll do less protections because we'll all be immune and we won't have to worry. In regards to the DMT, I'm not sure I understand that, but there should not be any differences based on the DMT you're on or whether you've just taken your DMT in terms of adhering to that guidance, which is to keep wearing your mask, social distance, and hand hygiene.
So I know you talked with Jon about the risk or not having evidence of a risk for relapse or worsening of MS with these vaccines. People are asking a lot of questions around reports in the news of transverse myelitis from some of the clinical trials of the vaccines. And could you comment on that? Were those the clinical trials for the vaccines that are approved for use in the US, or were they other clinical trials?
So this is a very important point and confusing because there's a lot of data that's being presented in the media and not in a form where we're used to getting science. So there are no cases of transverse myelitis in the vaccines that are currently approved for emergency use in the United States. So no evidence of transverse myelitis in the mRNA vaccines that we have available to us now. In terms of other vaccines, there's a whole panoply of other vaccines, but I think there is some data now published for the vaccine that was manufactured by AstraZeneca, and there were some cases of transverse myelitis reported in that study. I want to emphasize that the vaccine in that AstraZeneca is making is very different from the mRNA vaccines. They use a different method to introduce the vaccine material into the body, and that is that they actually use a virus, an adenovirus. And so again, we haven't yet tackled this in our group, and we don't want to say that one vaccine is better than another. We will be looking very closely at that data, but for the moment, what our recommendations are is based on what we know about the mRNA vaccines and there have been no cases of inflammatory demyelination of any kind that we're aware of in those 2 vaccines that we have provided advice for.
Great. John, can I sneak in another question? You know, I always do this to you.
You have to talk fast, Julie.
Okay, I think this is one you covered, so we'll reiterate it because we're still hearing questions about it. What about people who are in the high risk group for getting COVID? Some of those risk factors that we know are true for people living with MS that increase their odds for a worse outcome if they get COVID. Is the vaccine riskier for them, or should they be first in line to get the vaccine to protect them?
They should be first in line. The vaccine is not riskier for people who are at higher risk for having bad COVID. So, and that's when you're looking at risk benefit, it's even clearer. So if you have the risk factors for having severe COVID, you are the one who should be first in line. And there will be opportunities for individuals like that to get the vaccine very soon based on those other comorbidities. So if you have diabetes, hypertension, renal failure, then you can, and you also happen to have MS, you should be getting first in line to get the vaccine. Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Julie. And thanks to all of you who submitted your questions. And of course, thank you, Dr. Sicotte, for being with us today. I think that one of the best things that anyone can do for themselves, especially during these uncertain times, is to make sure that the information they're getting is credible and reliable. So we'd like to share some resources with you, and these are resources that you can count on. I want to remind you that if we were unable to get to your questions today, the National MS Society's MS Navigator team is your best partner in answering your questions and connecting you to the very best information and resources. For additional information on the COVID-19 vaccine guidance for people living with MS, please visit the Society's website at nationalmssociety.org/COVID vaccine. These are especially difficult times for so many people, and I want to make sure that you're aware that the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They offer free and confidential support for people in distress, as well as suicide prevention and crisis resources for you or your loved ones. You can reach them by calling 1-800-273-8255. Every week on the Real Talk MS podcast, I continue the conversation that we start here. So I hope you'll take a few minutes and give Real Talk MS a listen. You'll find the Real Talk MS podcast at realtalkms.com, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, wherever you find your favorite podcasts. With vital funding from supporters like you, the National MS Society will work to ensure that resources and programs like today's are available, and that the MS research community rebounds quickly from COVID-19, so the progress and momentum toward finding a cure continues. As you're able, please make a donation to the Society's COVID-19 Response Fund by texting the word GIVE to 68686, and you'll get a link right back to the MS Society's COVID-19 Response Fund webpage. I hope you'll consider contributing today. You can connect with the National MS Society on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and LinkedIn. And please make sure that you're on the Society's mailing list so you'll continue to receive the latest information on MS and updates on upcoming programs like this one. I'd like to thank Dr. Nancy Sicotte for joining us today, and I'd like to thank everyone who's joined us for your great questions. Please remember that a recording of this webcast will be available at the Society's website at nationalmssociety.org/MSexpert, as well as on Facebook and on YouTube. And on January 20th, the MS Society will be hosting an Ask an MS Expert program in Spanish to review the new COVID-19 vaccine guidelines that we've been discussing today. I hope you'll join us next Friday for Ask an MS Expert, when I'll be joined by Dr. Ilana Katz-Sand from the Corinne Goldsmith Dickinson Center for MS at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York. And we'll be talking about MS diet research studies and dietary recommendations for people living with MS. And now I have a favor to ask each of you. Getting your feedback on today's webcast is important. So you'll see a survey pop up in a moment when we close out. And if you're watching on Facebook Live, you'll see a link to that survey pinned to the comments section. And on YouTube, you'll find that link in the program description. Completing the survey makes a real difference. The information you provide helps us continuously improve, and it helps shape future programs. The survey takes just 1 minute, so I hope you'll take a minute and fill it out. On behalf of Dr. Nancy Sicotte and the National MS Society, I want to thank you once again for joining us. Please stay safe and make healthy choices.